5 seed on the play with Blue-Red Delver. He has torn up the field today on the back of a full playset of Treasure Cruises, along with playset of another nice little one-drop from Khans of Tarkir. That's Monastery Swift Spear.
Excuse me, not Swift Blade, the Swift Spear.
Yeah, he uses a spear, not a blade.
Yeah.
You know, he's more of a warrior, or like a pikeman, if you would. Anyway, Bob is on the play here. He's going to start out by fetching up Volcanic Island.
I thought all the Jeskai humans were...
They're warriors, right?
I think you're thinking of Bardu. I think that's
they're
right, shamans.
You're right. They're monks.
Monks, excuse me,
they're
monks.
They show off their prowess because they're monks. A monk wouldn't use a blade. A spear is a much more monk-like weapon.
Right.
Blades are for assassins and that sort of type. Anyway, it's going to be Delver of Secrets into play turn 1 for Bob. A lot of this matchup for him is going to be whether or not he can control the explosive draws from Jake's deck. See turn 1, Island, Lotus Petal. It's going to be a ponder with Day's Insurance.
It appears as though Bob has mulliganed as well. 6-card hand right now.
Yeah. And we will see what kind of draw Jake has put together. It is a good amount of pressure from Bob. His control cards here appear to be just a Daze, though. No flip from the Delver of Secrets. Second Young Pyromancer was the draw, and for Bob, he was hoping to just naturally draw the second land, I think.
So Jake had the opportunity to Daze this, but apparently he wants to save the Daze in hand while Bob is Mana Light for the fight over whatever he's trying to resolve, eventually Exhume or Reanimate, which I like here.
Yeah, we'll see. I'm interested to see how Bob plays this. I somewhat thought he would have upkeep Brainstormed there, but instead he's going to Brainstorm, swing with Delver, and play a fetch land, thereby passing the turn. On top of his deck is a third land, so unless he cracks the fetch land, Delver's not going to flip again.
I like not cracking there from Bob's spot, because if there's any spell on top, it's a free roll for him to not use the Brainstorm. If there's a land on top, he gets to play the land and cast Young Pyromancer that's in his hand. So the only bad cards on top of his deck are creatures. He happened to draw one of them, but...
Right, he did draw another Young Pyromancer.
He's pretty comfortably hedged there because either lands or spells are both solid cards to have on top of the deck.
All right, it's going to be an Entomb from Moldowsky, and the counter war does begin. Bob's going to go ahead and Force of Will the Entomb. Jake will Force of Will it back. The only other control card in Huang's hand is a Daze.
But I think the reanimation spell in Jake's hand may be Exhume, and if so, this Daze will be good.
Yeah, well, he's going to cast Exhume, and this Daze is good here, and this is aggressive on Jake's side. Had he waited until next turn to try again on the Exhume, Huang wouldn't have had any way to fight over it. But because he went for it that turn, Huang's actually going to go ahead and get this Exhume with a Daze.
Which is excellent for him, and now Jake has to wait until he draws another reanimation spell. I'm curious that he did not go for Elish Norn there. I mean, it didn't matter because he was not able to reanimate the card in question, but I do not believe Bob can beat it.
He would triple burn spell it. Yep.
Sure.
That's his out. It's not a very good one. You see there, Bob pitching Treasure Cruise to Force of Will, a card that has really, in Bob's words, carried the day in all his fair matches. Not as good against this fast combo.
Yeah, Rudy Briska, for example, was speaking his praises as a 1 or 2 of in Delver decks. Bob went all the way here. He said he read, I believe, Frank Carson's article on the card, who claimed the card was super powerful. The list in question started off with 2, and then he quickly went up to a 3rd and 4th copy after playing some games.
And I would not be surprised if this becomes a 4 of in a lot of these Delver strategies. Having watched a lot of Bob's matches today, I would say this card is just impressive.
Yeah.
Ponder there for Moldowsky. He sets it up with another land, and finally the Insectile Aberration will flip. Bob flips it with a Treasure Cruise, and even though this is an unfair matchup, you look at Bob's graveyard, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 cards in there. He already can cast Treasure Cruise if he has, and that's going to be his turn. Pay 2, exile 6, draw 3.
This is something that Ancestral Visions cannot do. You can just draw it and cast it. That's a huge difference.
You see this as turn 4 for Bob, for example. I know this is a perfectly reasonable time to be casting this kind of card. Bob fills up his graveyard at the pace of 2 to 3 cards a turn. Really discounts this kind of spell. Draws 3. I don't believe he found another land, however. But he did find a Jataxian Probe, so we'll see what he's working against. On Moldowski's side, it is Ponder and Underground Sea. Say that one carefully because Moldowsky did hide a lot of his good cards there.
Yep. Not very much information to be gained there, other than that Jake has a lot of shots at it next turn.
Yeah, Jake draws a Scalding Tarn here, so he's going to be able to have another land. And ponder Delver of Secrets, Brainstorm remaining. He'll start off with a fetch. And Bob's, after navigating that counter war, is that Treasure Cruise really has helped him find a lot of pressure right now.
He's got a lot of stuff to do, and he could really use one more counterspell here because he's ahead, but that could easily slip away from him. And even though he hasn't found anything really proactive to do, he's finding a lot of shots at another counterspell.
Yeah, and you see, he had the option to try to up the clock there with Delver of Secrets. Instead, he went for Ponder, and I completely agree here. He's going to find a Force of Will, and that seems to be exactly what he wants.
He knows that Jake gets a bunch of looks at it next turn with that Ponder in hand, so he is not safe, and I like giving up the attack here to try to find a little bit more defense.
Now, if you're in the Doubters camp on Treasure Cruise, I just want to throw this out here. Right now, Bob cast a Treasure Cruise this very turn. It looks like there's another one in his top 3. And if you look at it, his graveyard already has 3 more cards in it. Next turn, he could play a 4th land, and then he's already 1 mana away from Treasure Cruising again.
Also, another thing to keep in mind about all of this is Bob's in the finals right now, and looks like he's on his way to win game 1, most likely. This is week 1. It's not even that we found the best Treasure Cruise deck necessarily.
No, this is just a deck that can play 4 of them, not necessarily the best deck with 4 of them. Ponder from Jake, that's going to be a shuffle. No help here. He just needs to find a reanimation spell. So an Exhume, a Reanimate. We do know there is Force of Will plus blue card in Bob's hand, so it's going to be a little trickier. But we'll see what Jake can do. Draw for the turn. Bob's going to cast a Brainstorm. See 3 lands there, and one of them's a fetch land, so he can just get himself right up to another draw 3.
Yep, and I think that's what he's going to set himself up for. I don't know if he wants to keep the Bolt necessarily. It's pretty low impact. It's probably between Bolt and Delver as the worst card in his hand once you get past the non-fetch land that I'm sure he'll be shuffling back.
Yeah, remember, the Reanimator deck doesn't actually kill creatures very well, if at all. So that Insectile Aberration is just a permanent source of damage. He doesn't have to keep, say, another Delver in case he loses the first one.
Yeah.
Despite the 3 cards possible on Treasure Cruise, he keeps it in his hand so that it can pair up with that Force of Will right now. And Myth-Verdant Catacombs and a pass from Jake. Top card from Bob. It is an instant. It's Lightning Bolt. Delver's going to flip. 5 cards in graveyard. Does he actually want to draw a Lightning Bolt? That's the question now. It looks like it's a 2-turn clock both ways.
Exactly. That's exactly what I was about to say. It doesn't really look, as you mentioned, the Reanimator deck's not going to kill either of these Insectile Aberrations. So it's just a question of, does the Lightning Bolt accelerate the clock? It does not, as Jake is on 11, so it's 6 times 2 regardless. Lightning Bolt, not a very good draw here.
Full set of Volcanic Islands. Bob would love to draw a blue card here, as that would give him the leeway to draw 3 more cards.
Yeah.
Doesn't really want to cast that Treasure Cruise until he has a second blue card, though. Would hate to end up with Force of Will and no card to pitch to it. We'll see what he draws for the turn. It's red. It's Monastery Swift Spear.
Well, that does change the clock a little bit, but probably still not worth firing off the Treasure Cruise here, because I just don't think
He
Jake,
needs to.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Jake winning through a Force of Will here seems like a very low possibility. So it doesn't accelerate the clock again to pump the Monastery 1 point. So just play your Raging Goblin and...
The other Khans of Tarkir All-Star enters the battlefield. And now Bob needs to think. He can cast that Treasure Cruise for 2 mana and exiling his yard if he wants to prowess it. There's no real need to. He should be good both ways.
And the other problem with casting it is, even if Bob finds a blue card to pair with the Force of Will, he will tap low enough that Spell Pierce suddenly becomes a factor. So.
Yeah, as tempting as it is, and you really want to. Whenever I have a card in my hand that says 2 mana, draw 3, if I ever could get a card like that, I would just want to cast them all the time.
Trust me, I sympathize with Bob's dilemma right now. I would not say that I like drawing cards as much as the next person, because that's not true, but I still enjoy it just fine.
Sure.
But I think he's hard-pressed to lose this game if he just moves into combat and says go.
All right, and here's a swing. That's for 7. Jake will go down to 4. And a pass from Bob. Sitting back on the forcible, it's hard to see him losing the game. And Thought sees the card from Jake. That'll be no help. He doesn't have the combo. And game one should go toward the blue-red Delver player, and it does. Bob Huang, 1-0, takes the lead.
Pretty impressive stuff there, although not highlighting a lot of the new content there. The one Treasure Cruise did come up and was very powerful. The Monastery Swift Spear, less impressive, but showed up Showed up a little late to the party, no big deal.
Yeah. Back to the booth here, Matthias Hunt and Patrick Sullivan. We're going to ask you the last trivia question of the night. Grand Prix Orlando. So this one is for 12 months of Star City Games Premium.
And I have this one.
All right.
You don't
Please
mind.
do it.
Our Grand Prix, 3 people in the booth. You, myself, we're going to be there. Can you name the third person in the booth? And for extra credit, extra, rolls, spins of the dice, whatever you want to call them, to get this full year of Star City Games Premium, can you tweet that person's Twitter handle inside of your answer?
All right.
Again,
if you know this person's name, and especially if you know this person's Twitter handle,
because
make sure you have
he really likes this
SCG Premium on your answer. You tweet that, and at the end of these finals, we will have one winner for 12 months. All right, back into the match here. Jake Moldowsky gets to be on the play this time. He is a fast combo deck. Fast combo can be pretty good here, but sometimes Delver is among its harder matchups. What can Jake do to combat these fast starts paired with Disruption?
He has 3 copies of Abrupt Decay, 2 Spell Pierce, 2 Duress, an Iona, an Aetherling, 2 copies of Pithy Needle, a Crippling Fatigue, 2 copies of Tormod's Crypt, and a Blazing Archon. I think a Blazing Archon's probably a better reanimator target than the Sire of Insanity, for example, so that can come in.
Sure. Iona's probably better than Tidespout Tyrant as well, right?
That makes sense. So, especially against a deck that has Young Pyromancer. So the question then becomes, what do you do with some of these secondary options? The Abrupt Decays seem pretty good to me. It's a straightforward removal spell, and he can use it in the matchup, something that he doesn't have to worry about soft counters. After that, there becomes some lesser options. Spell Pierce and Duress, they're spells in the matchup. It doesn't feel like Jake can really dilute his deck that much. I'm curious to see if he wants to bring in the 1 copy of Crippling Fatigue. I'm sure that's more for hate bear type strategies, but it is an extra piece of removal, and if he has enough flex slots in his deck, maybe he brings that in as well.
All right, over on Bob's side, though he's a blue-red Delver deck, he's particularly heavy on the red elements of the deck. A lot of his sideboard are cards like Blood Moon, Sulfuric Vortex, Grim Lavamancer. He has his 3 Pyroblasts. I would imagine he'd use those. And he does have a pair of Grafdigger's Cages, particularly potent against a Reanimator strategy.
Yeah, Grafdigger's Cage is great here, of course, and even if Jake didn't want to bring in the Abrupt Decays to fight over creatures, he has to fight over Grafdigger's Cage, so that forces the hand there.
Yeah, and as I said before, Jake doesn't have a show and tell game plan in here, so if there's a turn 1 Grafdigger's Cage from Bob Huang, that's going to be a lot of trouble for Jake. He's going to have to Abrupt Decay it.
Jake is using more flex slots in his sideboard on Reanimator targets than I typically see, and that's where some of the space is coming on. Usually you see, 1 kind of backup, a Grave Titan or something like that in people's sideboards as a backup Reanimator target. He has 3, and Crippling Fatigue is also an Entomb Bullet. So that's where the cost of the show and tell package comes in, is trying to fit in these cards.
Yeah, it does give him a lot of leeway in other matchups, but makes him especially susceptible to hate cards.
But if you're not anticipating playing against a lot of them, and
yeah,
there's this interesting dynamic in Legacy where, because of Deathrite Shaman hating on graveyard strategies and being potent against them, a lot of people skimp on the explicit, the Tormod's Crypts and the Grafdigger's Cages. So it's not the worst plan to just ignore that kind of stuff or assume that your Abrupt Decays are going to be good enough to get you through it, because people aren't bringing that much to the table. I remember Legacy 3-4 years ago where 4 copies of Tormod's Crypt or 4 copies of Leyline of the Void were mandatory in people's sideboards because there was enough Dredge and Reanimator that you had to come prepared. Now there's less of those decks, and the field as a whole is a lot more diverse than it used to be. So people have started shaving out those kind of slots. You still see Rest in Pieces in people's sideboards and, various Delver strategies and Miracles and so forth, but not a lot of the most egregious anti-graveyard cards than you saw in years past.
And that's, I think, where you get caught a lot of times on a card like Grafdigger's Cage. Grafdigger's Cage is a hate card for the graveyard, but it's not explicitly for the graveyard. So it's not going Tormod's Crypt level against a Reanimator deck, because you can put a Grafdigger's Cage in your sideboard and say, hey, this is going to be good against Elf combo as well. This can be okay against Storm. They do try to flash back cards. There's applications of this, but it does, incidentally, while hating those things, stop the entire Reanimator game plan.
Yep, and that's why so many of them have gone to show and tell. but Jake, again, not with such an option this weekend.
Yeah, so far, though, he really hasn't needed it, especially when you saw his matchup against, well, Manalus Dredge. His game one game plan, so quick and efficient, he didn't really need to do much more.
Game is a charitable description of what we saw.
Yeah.
I think that
is one of the...
I think game one failed to meet the minimum requirement to be called a game.
Well,
two people were
you
hanging
have
out.
never had a permanent in either game.
Right.
Zero permanents both games. Never dredged a single card.
Jake controlled more of that player's
yeah.
permanents than he did. He had a shambling shell.
Yeah, he did put one of Yuha's permanents into play. That's +1. +1 on his opponent.
Yep.
So, but going into the finals, this seems like a tougher matchup for him. Just because his fast draws aren't going to go uncontested here. Bob's going to fight over them and have a pretty reasonable clock of his own.
Well, that's exactly what happened in game one. Jake had a very explosive opening, but Bob was able to cobble together just enough of a defense and then kill him before Jake could reassemble.
Yeah, and it does come down to the one turn Jake went for the exhume there as fast as possible, which there is some merit to doing that. Letting Bob draw a card could be all sorts of bad. Bob draws a ponder, he could find another force of will. Maybe he has a ponder and simply didn't cast it. I think there's a lot of value to how Jake played that.
I agree totally. It's not just Bob's draw step, but it's all the cantrips that allow him many more draw steps. So it, generally speaking, only gets worse.
All right, Jake is on the play for this game. Yeah, he's going to keep. Bob had a 0 lander. That one certainly won't do. And he'll be down to 6 cards.
Still, Bob can play a very resource-like game, much in the same way that Jake can. So, mulliganing, Bob's hand was an easy mulligan, no lands, of course, but I think he can even afford to aggressively mulligan for the right pieces because this is probably not much of an attrition battle. This is, do you have the stuff on both sides of the table?
There's a very low probability that Bob will win before Jake assembles the full combo. We saw that game one. Bob had to win the fight over Jake's combo and then kill Jake before he reloaded. And I'm expecting that's going to be the rhythm of most of these games. The idea that Bob would just, there will be some number of games, I suppose, where Jake just fails to find his combo, where his deck doesn't work. But Reanimator, by and large, is pretty redundant. And where it not so susceptible to graveyard hate, it would be the best combo deck in Legacy.
I agree with that assessment. It's so good. But it has some very obvious weaknesses.
Yeah, its weaknesses is to hate cards, but when your opponent doesn't have hate for it, this deck is powerful, fast, and consistent. It is everything a combo deck wants to be.
And disruptive.
Yeah.
I mean, it gets to play Daze, Thoughtseize, Force of Will as well.
Right. It is certainly a strong strategy. So we'll see if Bob can get there on 6 cards. He really wants something like 1 threat and a bunch of disruption. He needs to win that one fight. And Force of Will, land, that seems, Pyroblast seems pretty close to exactly what he wants.
Yeah, I do not believe there's a threat, but it does have the rest of the pieces.
And we'll get to see what he has. It is, like you said here, it's 1 land, it's a Tarn, and 5 disruption spells. So Tarn, 2 Force of Wills, the Pyroblast, the Lightning Bolt, and a Daze. Lightning Bolt, interesting card in the matchup. Not particularly strong, but probably just not far enough down the list that Bob gets decided out.
Well, he has 2 Force Bolts and a Chain Lightning, and it's better than that.
Those are worse,
Yeah.
yep.
And I don't know if he wants the full play set of Treasure Cruises.
That makes me sad. I really like the card.
Yeah,
I was really happy with how it was last game, but I understand it does cost 8 in a game where the pivotal part of the game happens on turns 1 through 3. Take it away. Huge draw here.
Yeah, that's the clock as it is.
The Swift Spear comes raging in here for 1 damage.
And now that Lightning Bolt in Bob's hand just got quite a bit better.
Now, let's compare. We were talking about the 1 red 1-drops that can happen in this deck. All right, the other 2 that you used to see play in Blue-Red Delver are Goblin Guide and Grim Lavamancer. Now, you can't really play Grim Lavamancer in a 4 Treasure Cruise deck, and those Treasure Cruises have been so good that I understand why Bob doesn't play that. What are your thoughts on Swift Spear versus Goblin Guide?
I never liked Goblin Guide very much in a deck with Spell Pierce and Daze, because that comes up, that you're letting him draw lands and then you have soft counters in your deck. So you're probably giving up a little bit in terms of your raw speed, but you are synergizing much better with the rest of the elements of your deck.
Yeah, definitely agree here. Turn 2, Brainstorm from Jake. He does play a fetch land too, so he's going to get to sculpt his hand, decide when he wants to fight. We do see one of his combo cards here, but it looks like he may not have both pieces. He has a Petal, another Brainstorm, a Ponder, a fetch land, all the cantripping he could want, but no combo just yet.
And this hand would have been great for Jake before that draw step, but now he does have to get something going, you know, not super fast, but there is a clock.
Yeah, and he knows about all this permission in Bob's hand. He did take the Pyroblast, but there's a Daze and 2 Force of Wills. He knows if he goes for a cantrip here, he may just get dazed. Bob doesn't have a second land. We'll see if he just wants to daze it to get the Lotus Petal off the board.
I'll say this, the Monastery Swift Spear does not play particularly well with counter spells.
No, he's good with the Lightning Bolt and Jataxian Probe and Ponder sides of Bob's deck, but the other half of the instance, not as good. Bob's going to let the Ponder resolve, and we'll see what Jake can put together.
I'm interested to see if this card has legs in Modern, because there is a good density, good density of spells, and the power level format's much lower, and Burns probably a more legitimate deck or more played deck in Modern than it is in Legacy.
It is interesting. The power level of this card scales with the mana curve of your format. Modern, the cards in the format are a little more expensive, so you're not going to load up your graveyard as fast. That said, I can't imagine it won't see any play. It seems too powerful not to.
I like that Bob has taken the Tarmogoyf die, placed it next to the Monastery Swift Spear, but doesn't really change it because, you know, it's not really it's not worth the effort.
That turn, he Lightning Bolted main phase to pump the Swift Spear, then swung, so 5 damage in for Bob. His draw was Flooded Strand. And his remaining 3 cards, Force of Will, Daze. Jake knows about all 3. See if he can combo through them. He's at 11. Still has a good amount of time. Swift Spear's only dealing 1 a turn. And a Brainstorm here from Jake. It looks like he's going to have, I don't know. I don't see Bob dealing enough damage in time here. Jake looks like he can just set up for the perfect combo turn.
Well, that sometimes is impossible to happen to Reanimator if you get them low enough. Because Reanimate cares about your life total, Bob doesn't have to get them all the way dead. He can get them down to a fairly low life total and then just fight over Exhume. So don't forget about that as well.
Yeah. Exhume is a 2-mana spell, so harder to win a counter war over versus the 1-mana Reanimate. Jake has a Thoughtseize in hand, but giving away 2 life to Bob is certainly not free at this point.
Especially since you know his hand could very well be force blue card, and then your Thoughtseize isn't even worth that much.
Right. It's force Daze. He knows all 3.
So you're not really freeing up that much.
No, you're stopping Bob from being able to Daze on your 4-mana board.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not great. And Bob, the draws keep coming here. He's going to cast a pre-combat Brainstorm. That's his draw for the turn. It will pump the Swift Spear. And before he draws, Jake's going to fight a bit of a counter war here.
And I think that Bob should fight because it's sort of 6 of one, half dozen of the other, what he chooses to fight over. But initiating on his own turn when he has the Swift Spear in play is much better. Yeah,
he casts Daze now on this Entomb, and as Jake fights this counter war, he's taking more damage. Swift Spear all the way up to 3/4 at the moment. You see Bob's draw. It is Treasure Cruise, 2nd Swift Spear, 3rd land. He's going to have to put 2 of them back.
So currently 4 cards in his graveyard, with the Brainstorm on the stack is 5. Flooded Strand is 6. So I do not believe he can, with the 1 mana left over, he's a little bit short. He still can keep Forcible Treasure Cruise and go for it again next turn.
Yeah, our apologies here. He did not Daze that first spell. He forced it pitching the Daze. So that's why he only has 1 force left at the moment. Puts 2 back here. Swinging 3 damage off the Swift Spear. Brainstorm resolves. And right now there are 5 cards in Bob's graveyard. So this fetch line will make it 6. He can Treasure Cruise next turn. But I guess the question will be, is there going to be a next turn?
Yeah.
Jake certainly gearing up with a lot of mana for a pretty good turn.
I mean, Thoughtseize, Entomb, Exhume gets it done.
See Gristlebrand in Jake's hand. His draw was Entomb. That was a spell he just lost a counter war over, so he has Entomb Exhume.
And Thoughtseize. So I think he's good to go.
You'll see this starting with Thoughtseize. He'll put Jake down to 5. It's Treasure Cruise and Force of Will. No sense in forcing that. You're going to lose the Force either way. Might as well keep the Treasure Cruise. Well, actually, doesn't matter which one you lose. Yeah, you lose the Treasure Cruise. He loses his counter spell ability. Yeah. And next card is Entomb. Looks like he wants Gristlebrand. Perhaps he wants Elesh Norn. It's close.
Well, now we're in the spot where Elesh Norn is risky because it's possible for Jake to get bolted out of this game. So I like getting Gristlebrand here because you want to attack once and then you're probably in the clear.
And here's Exhume. Gristlebrand enters the battlefield. Jake's down to 5. But with just a Force of Will in Bob's hand, it's going to be tough to deal these remaining 5 before Jake gains 7. See what he can do. He could draw a Brainstorm this turn. And he could Brainstorm. Now, nope. I was going to say he could get Bolt, and a Lamb. He's a mana short and can't cast them both.
I guess there's a series of draws involving Gitaxian Probes, running Gitaxian Probes that allows him to make his Swift Spear large enough that Gristlebrand has to chump. But that's asking a lot.
Oh, man. Yeah, that would do it if he gets the whole set of probes. Is it real Magic plays? And not going to work. Jake's going to get to swing and gain 7 here. He's up to 12, casting Careful Study. And that's the corner has been turned here.
Yeah, there's no catching up. I don't even know if Jake is going to bother activating this Gristlebrand at any point. I suspect not. And just allow the Exalted Angel to take this home.
Yeah. Giant 7/7 lifelinker. Good enough without an ability here. Swift Spear, though, will put Jake down to 11.
You got to let him know that you're not going to take this laying down.
Bob down to 3 off the Gristlebrand. And looks like we'll be going to a decider here. And that will be it. Another Swift Spear for Bob. So he could have swung for 2 that turn, but needed to swing for 18. All right, we're on to game 3, though. Blue-Red Delver versus Reanimator. Remember, Bob was on the draw and mulligan that game. You have to think things will go better when they go back to how they were game 1 with Bob on the play.
For as potentially good as the Swift Spear is in this deck, it's clearly still a step below Delver of Secrets. I mean, if Bob has Delver on turn 1 and is able to flip it, I think that's a very different game.
Yeah, not to mention there are those 2 copies of Grafdigger's Cage that we have seen in Bob's board. And while he's not odds on to draw a 2 of in his opening hand, it certainly is in the realm of possibility. So if he hits one of those, you have to think the game's pretty heavily in his favor. Because he's on the play, he can dodge cards like Duress and Thoughtseize with the Grafdigger's Cage.
And that might be an argument for some very aggressive mulliganing for the reason you just gave. It's hard for Jake to beat. He can have Abrupt Decay to break out of it, but it's a challenge to assemble everything.
Yeah, and I mean, you only want to really aggressively mulligan if you believe the matchup to be pretty bad. There's a very good chance that, as we saw in game 1, Bob can win this match conventionally. You know, maybe he doesn't have the cage, but if his hand is reasonable and has a good pressure, he'll probably keep it anyway.
Yeah, Delver and some counterspells and some cantrips, that's still sufficient to get it done. So he doesn't have to go completely off the deep end mulliganing for Grafdigger's Cage, but if his hand is marginal, I think he should feel pretty liberal about sending it back.
Yeah, because he does have the option to draw Grafdigger's Cage, which means even his mulls to 5 stand a decent shot of getting there if they can have a cage in them.
Yeah.
Over on Jake's side, talk a little about what he's looking for on the board. He's going to be behind a bit here. Do cards like Duress maybe or Abrupt Decay gain value?
I believe so, and Jake brought in the Duresses anyway for game 2. It showed up when he Careful Studied there towards the end of the game, so I would imagine he's probably, I mean, it does look like he's doing some pretty heavy sideboarding. I'm not sure if there's anything in particular he's looking to change. There is occasionally some play draw bias when you're playing against Dazed decks and how you want your deck exactly configured, but I don't know if there's that much of that element going on here. Again, this deck is all engine and setup, so there's not a ton of wiggle room.
Yeah. In Jake's deck, the Abrupt Decays buy him a lot of time, though, right? They're not only good answers to Grafdigger's Cage, but when you're playing against a Delver-style deck, they do only have 12 creatures, and it's because Abrupt Decay is uncounterable, if Jake can even stick an Abrupt Decay on one of the early creatures, he could buy himself a lot of turns to assemble that combo and maybe win a counter war over it.
And what's also nice about this matchup compared to other Delver lists is Bob has no copies of Wasteland, I believe, so Jake can be very liberal about getting his Tropical Island, his Bayou, and facilitating these off-color spells.
Yeah, no, that was interesting. There were no copies of Wasteland in Bob's deck. A little bit of that is a concession to the mana curve of his deck. One thing we mentioned was that Young Pyromancer is the only spell that costs more than 1, unless you're counting Treasure Cruise, which, to be fair, he hopes to play on 1. So a card like Wasteland is largely a spell in his deck as opposed to a land. It doesn't really help him cast much of anything.
The mana base on blue-red decks, the blue-red Delver decks historically has not been very good. It's actually worse somehow than many of the 3-color decks. So you can't really afford to have Wastelands. The deck is 2-color mana sensitive, has a lot of 1-mana spells across both colors, and a Wasteland facilitates basically nothing.
Yeah, it's not as much of a tempo deck and definitely more of a burn deck, you would say.
Yeah.
We're underway here. See the deck list there. Remember, players do get to know what their opponents are playing deck list-wise, but only between games. Once the match starts, they do not have access to the deck list. And with that said, we are underway. This is our final game here in the finals in New Jersey. It's Bob Huang and Blue-Red Delver. He's on the play, trying to defeat his Reanimator opponent, Jake Moldowsky. And despite a one-lander, it looks like Bob's going to keep. We'll see whether or not Jake wants to. He has a one-lander with multiple Careful Study. 3, to be specific.
Which you can rationalize digs you out of mulligans when you have pieces you already want to put in the graveyard. So if that hand has Careful Study and a Gristlebrand, then you can view those Careful Studies as smoothing out your draw. Jake had no such pieces. It was just other cantrips, exhumes, and so forth. So those Careful Studies are much closer to mulligans than they are to things to facilitate his draw. And at that point, you have to send the hand back.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of things that really push it in that direction. So first of all, like you said, he doesn't actually have the monster to put into the graveyard there. On top of that, his land is basic island. You know, maybe if that's a polluted delta, maybe if that's an underground sea, he's a lot closer to keeping it because, you know, say it is, for example, a blue-black land, he could Careful Study on turn 1 and possibly just Reanimate on turn 2, never even having to find another land. But because he has an island, now there's 2 pieces he has to find, and that's just putting a lot of pressure on Careful Study.
It's a hand that's so close to keeping on a number of levels. Just a Gristlebrand in hand or a different land, as you mentioned, but there's just too many things that can fail with that hand.
Yeah, Jake going down to 5 cards. Certainly not where he wants to be, but remember, this style of combo deck can perform very well on mulligans.
Yeah, it does have the 1-2 punch, the lick and stick element to it, but when you're playing against Blue-Red Delver, post-board, they're generally going to having some number of Spell Pierces, Pyroblasts, Dazes, Force of Wills, whatever, and that's where, you know, the mulligans to 5 really come back to haunt you. You need to be able to play back against that stuff, and it's hard to have everything when you need something in the graveyard, something to reanimate it, and then some backup.
All right, and down to 5 cards. This looks like a keeper for Bob. It's a one-lander, but it has Reanimate, Duress, Careful Study, Brainstorm. Probably the best hand of the 3 he's seen.
I would imagine so.
That said, Bob is on the play. It's going to be a turn 1 Volcanic Island, and Delver of Secrets. Reminiscent of Game 1. We'll see what Jake can do here. And it is an Entomb. So now he has options.
Wow.
He can turn 1 Careful Study, turn 1 Duress, turn 1 go for the Entomb Exhume combo. A lot of ways to play it. He's going to go with the Duress to start out.
And I like opening here because if he draws a land next turn, could just be good to go if the coast is clear.
Yeah, if there's only 1 permission spell and he gets it right now, and I think that actually is the case, he'll be in a great spot. Bob kept a one-lander on the play as well. You see a pair of Young Pyromancers, a Ponder, a Daze, and a Treasure Cruise, and Duress is actually going to eat the Daze in Bob's hand. He doesn't want Jake to know just how light of a hand he kept.
Yeah.
Draw here for Bob. It's a Delver of Secrets. So he'll swing with his Delver. I imagine we'll see a Ponder out of Bob here. He can either play Ponder or Delver. And he's just going to make the second Delver.
I like trying to get aggressive here because it's hard to imagine Jake's going to kill you next turn, even though we know that's a possibility. And he wants to establish as much pressure and then keep the shields up.
All right, you see the play from Jake here was Brainstorm. He did draw into that second land he needs. The second land was a Gristlebrand. He also has this Force of Will, but no blue card to pair with it just yet.
And he's just down on cards in a general sense, so he may not have the luxury of trying to keep those kind of cards. He may just have to jam it next turn.
Well, he's got a lot going on here, right? He can crack this fetch land, play the Careful Study. Sorry, it's a Careful Study, not a Force of Will. So he has no counter spells at the moment. But with Careful Study, he may be able to find what he needs here to get to this Reanimate next turn, maybe even with some backup for Dazes.
Yeah.
A pretty reasonable shot for Jake right now.
Oh, for a 5-card hand, you can't ask for much better than this. I mean, he can even just keep double Reanimate and try to go way over the top.
Just Reanimate. If he counters it, Reanimate again.
Yep.
I like that a lot. He's going to put back the Careful Study, actually, and just passes the turn. So what are the advantages here? He kept the Entomb over the Careful Study, and I was a little surprised to see that.
He may figure that he can get Bob to fight a battle over this Entomb at the end of the turn. That doesn't really matter. Although I suppose if he has to shuffle his deck to the Polluted Delta, he can't afford to do that.
See here, Bob did draw Ponder for the turn. It flipped both of his Delvers into Insectile Aberrations, and Ponder is not going to show any help. There are no more lands in sight for Bob. It's 3 red cards. That's going to facilitate a shuffle.
There's nothing wrong with the cards that Bob was looking at there, but I think he is aware that he is in danger and needs to find something to do this turn to protect himself.
I mean, the irony of the situation is he's not going to be able to find it. If he finds a land, maybe he can brainstorm into something. But he did as well as he could. He found a Daze, but that's about it. And Jake with a great opportunity here. No land from Bob. He'll pass back. And we'll see what kind of fight happens right here. Does he want, and Jake wants to has to debate whether or not he wants to, okay, he's gonna upkeep Entomb.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't want to crack the Polluted Delta because he didn't want to expose himself to Daze. Now, yeah, he's just been playing around Daze the entire time.
Yeah.
What we know is if last turn he had just jammed Careful Study and said, thrown caution to the wind, said, I don't care about Daze, and jammed Careful Study, I think he would be in a position this turn to make Gristlebrand. Now, that's a very bold move, and maybe one that he doesn't want to take.
I think he feels like his hand may be good enough at this point that he can afford to be a little cautious and try to play over the top this turn.
Well, there is some danger here, right? Because he can't, in the end, he wasn't able to play around Daze. He's going to crack this fetch land, and he's going to have to go for a blind Reanimate because if he takes 6 and tries to play around Daze, then he won't be able to cast Reanimate anymore.
Yeah, and Reanimate's one of the dodgier ones to try to go off with too, because even if it resolves, then things like Bolt start mattering potentially next turn.
Yep, and Bob did blind draw that Daze off the Ponder, and a huge draw indeed. He dazes the Reanimate, gets to untap and put Jake down to 6. He needs one more piece of permission, though. Because we know next turn Jake can just go for the Exhume. And this is close indeed. Bob did draw his second land, but because he had to pick up a land, that's not going to matter. It's Volcanic Island again. The Insectile Aberrations swing, dropping Jake down to 6. It's a 1-turn clock. And now we go back to Jake's side. Draws Gristlebrand, that's no help. He is all in on this Exhume. Does it work? We will find out.
I mean, this is probably for match right here.
Can he find a Daze or a Force of Will? No, no. Third one is, no, he misses here. And this is huge. Jake's going to get the Gristlebrand into play.
And Jake knows it too, because I'm sure if Bob found some action here, he would have slammed it on the table immediately.
It's interesting. Can Bob, all right, so this is not a great spot for him, but there's still a chance here. If Bob on his own turn can get enough power on the board to threaten dealing 13 damage, and that's a lot.
Yep.
But if he can do it, then he can draw up a situation where Jake has a Gristlebrand and just can't attack with it.
The game's still not out of reach. I mean, Bob has a considerable clock in play. He still has bolts in his deck and so forth.
Yep, he's going to crack a fetch land. He got to put one of those cards from the Brainstorm back and shuffle it away. The other one he did have to draw. It's going to be Volcanic Island, though, for Bob Huang. And Gristlebrand's going to go to work starting next turn. Jake's not going to be able to draw cards with it. He's just on the 7/7 flying lifelink plan, but it's not a bad plan to be on right about now.
As long as Bob can keep the game close enough where his bolts are live draws, that's about the best he can do right now.
And we'll see what he wants to do. It could be Young Pyromancer and Jataxian Probe. That certainly isn't bad. It puts a lot of power on the board. One thing also to note, Bob could probe here and then tap 1 to Treasure Cruise.
I think at this point he needs to establish more power in play because the Treasure Cruise is unlikely to yield anything that matters this turn. And the game is entering this very time-sensitive place for Bob. So I think he needs to develop his board as much as possible. And then next turn he can fire off with that Treasure Cruise and try to gas back up.
Yeah, 6 cards in the yard right now, winning Treasure Cruise at 2 for its mana cost.
And there's sort of this issue of immediacy too. Young Pyromancer takes time to develop, so you want to get it in play as soon as possible. The Treasure Cruise is, you play it towards the end of the game, and that's still fine. You still look at the 3 cards.
Yeah, and he's doing exactly that. You need to get so much power on the board that Jake cannot safely attack with Gristlebrand. So first it's going to be Young Pyromancer, then Jataxian Probe. Bob's going to go to 16 and draw a card. The card was Monastery Swiftspear, which actually is an excellent card right now.
Another piece of the puzzle. Again, just trying to get enough pressure into play.
Remember, 13 damage is the target. Right now, Bob has 9. So if he takes 7, if Jake gains 7 here and goes to 13, point number 10 is Monastery Swiftspear. If Bob can cast 3 spells after the Swiftspear, then he has the 13 damage needed to get Jake. Or more easy path is Swiftspear plus Lightning Bolt would actually be exactly 13.
Exactly. I think even Bolt itself is now just lethal, assuming Jake sits back on defense, because Bob can bolt whatever Gristlebrand blocks, and the rest coming across is a lethal attack.
Yeah, Jake's just gonna have to swing and cross his fingers.
Exactly. Yeah, there's not a lot else to be done here.
Here's the attack. Bob down to 9, Jake up to 13. And there's another difficulty here that even if Bob doesn't find lethal, so he can put Jake down to maybe 3. And then on the following turn, Bob can actually take another 7 off Gristlebrand and then deal 10.
Yeah.
So I actually think Bob has the tools needed to race here. If Jake were to get this, he would actually need to make a reanimate again. So swing with Gristlebrand, then somehow make another Gristlebrand out of the graveyard, legend to rule his own Gristlebrand and pass.
Or just find an Elish Norn.
Or just find an Elish Norn, yeah.
Which is the easier way to do it.
Makes you wonder, there was a decision point where he had to decide whether or not he wanted to get Gristlebrand or Elish Norn with that Entomb.
I don't know. I mean, I understand that.
He was at 5 at the time.
I understand that, Bob has some burn elements in the deck, but given the board state that was at the time at this game, it's not like if Bob has a bunch of bolts in his hand, you're dying anyway because you're too low. So the card that he's playing around by not getting Elish Norn is something that he can't beat anyway. And Elish Norn, in the absence of just getting bolted out, is a lock. I mean, Bob can't operate against it.
Here's the turn for Bob. It's Monastery Swiftspear, followed by a 1-mana Treasure Cruise.
Konzatar Key are coming out, party.
And draws Land Brainstorm. It's a 2/3. So right now, remember, one of those elementals is summoning sick. So it's 1, 2, 3, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Bob could brainstorm, and if he finds a Jataxian Probe, he has lethal right now. However, there would be a danger to trying for the probe kill, and I don't even think he'd want to do it. Well, no, I was actually going to check that. I think he'd be fine. I was going to say if it gets pierced, it won't work, but now it'll still pump Swiftspear regardless of resolution.
Yep. It's just when you cast trigger, not a resolution.
So here goes. It's going to be a Ponder, almost same as Brainstorm. Pumps that Swiftspear up to a 3/4. That's point of damage number 12. And he finds a Daze. Had he found that one earlier, that would have worked, but...
Yeah, he could have dazed his own spell to get the last trigger.
Spell, yeah. So it looks like he's only going to go to deal 12. But that may be enough. It's not enough to kill him this turn, but Jake can't kill Bob on the swing back, which is more important.
Yeah, it may put Jake in a spot where he has to attack, draw 7, and then hope Elish Norn.
So hope he finds the cards to make an Elish Norn.
Exactly. I don't think there's a different path. I mean, he can't damage race anymore. The math's on the table. That's no longer an option.
And it's got to be very specific because Bob's going to put Jake down to 1. So when he swings, he's going to draw 7, go back down to 1. So not only will he have to make Elish Norn, but he'll have to do it without taking a single point of damage.
Yeah,
that
he needs to the perfect set of cards, basically.
No fetch lands, no reanimate. That it's going to have to be Elishnorn in the graveyard via Entomb or Careful Study, and then an Exhume for the Elishnorn.
Yeah.
But if he finds all those pieces, Jake can win at 1 life here. Back down to 1/2 on the Tarmogoyf die, or should we say the Monastery Swift Spear die.
Tarmogoyf Light.
Yeah. Always has 1 more toughness than power. It's a fitting die for it.
But I believe the writing's on the wall here that Jake can't win any other way, so he's just got to cross his fingers and hope that he has the perfect 7 here.
Yeah, this is going to be a little bit harder, too. There is a Daze in Bob's hand.
Oh, this is not going to be. I mean, it has
to be
untapped
Petal.
land, Petal.
untapped land, Petal, Elishnorn, or Entomb, and Reanimate. Or Exhume, apologies here.
And that did not look like a good 7. And Iona, Duress, some nonsense, I think.
He had a shot, but it had to be Elishnorn or Entomb. That was the first step. He doesn't have that. He does have the Petal. He doesn't have the Exhume. No way to find Elishnorn. No way to get her out of the graveyard, even if he had her.
I mean, he could still, I guess, brainstorm into Petal. I don't know. Maybe there's some perfect 3 cards here.
Yeah, he did find the Underground Sea and the Petal, so he was partway there. He found 2 of the 4 pieces he needed. But halfway doesn't do it. Now he has the 3rd piece. It's Entomb. But he would need an Exhume and another Petal to do it from here, I think. We'll see if Jake can find a way to navigate through here. He may not know he needs another Petal because he doesn't know yet about the Daze.
Well, the cards in his hand are the cards in his hand. He's going to make the best faith effort to resolve Exhume with playing around as much as he can. But
yeah,
he is at 1. There's
Yeah.
not a lot of room to be greedy about the sequencing.
I don't think he has the Exhume is the problem here. I think his only way to get a creature out of the yard is Reanimate.
Yeah.
He can't actually cast that one. He did have the untapped mana, though. Like I said, 3 of the 4 pieces now here. And he'll start by casting what I think would be an Entomb. Like I said, it's real close here. If he had 2 Petal, if he had an extra Petal and an Exhume, he could do it. Let's see if he sees something we don't, though. Entomb is going to be the play, leaving up 1 mana. Bob gets to decide whether or not he wants to Daze right now. I imagine whether you Daze now or Daze later, it doesn't really matter. Just Daze something.
Yeah.
All roads lead to the same spot. Maybe there's a card in Jake's deck that can be played out of the sideboard that we're not thinking of. There's the Elishnorn. But how does he get her into play? He can get her there. What's next? We will see. It's really hard here to be at 1 life in this deck. There's so many things that want your life points. He can't fight with Force of Will either. Ponder is the draw. He could Ponder into a Brainstorm into a bunch of Lotus Petals.
You could Ponder into Brainstorm and then Brainstorm into Petal Exhume, I guess is the
Yes.
the redraw.
That does still lose to, there's the Exhume, but it does still lose to the Daze, even
Torturous.
if you count everything. Finds the card, but so close. Moldowsky almost gets there on 5, but there you have it. Bob Huang, Blue-Red Delver. He's your Legacy champion here in New Jersey, winning the first Legacy Open with Cons of Tarkir Legal, playing a full 8 Cons cards in his deck.
I don't think we've ever seen anything like this in Legacy to week 1 of a set release.